She didn't know his name when she cut open his chest. She only knew he was bleeding out on the harbor concrete, 3 bullets in his torso, and that nobody around him was doing a damn thing except watching him die. So Serena Vale did what she always did. She got her hands dirty. What she didn't know, what nobody warned her about, was that saving this particular man's life would cost her everything she'd spent 32 years carefully building. If you've ever loved someone who didn't deserve it, stay with me until the end. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since 6 that evening, the kind of cold, indifferent rain that didn't announce itself. It just arrived and refused to leave, soaking through everything, softening nothing. Chicago's harbor district smelled the way it always did at night. Diesel, rust, and something underneath that had been rotting slowly for years, and nobody cared enough to find. Serena Vale was 40 minutes into the end of a double shift when she heard it. Not the shots. Those were already over. What she heard was the silence that came after. That particular quality of quiet that settles over a crowd when something has happened that everyone witnesses and no one wants to own. She was crossing Harbor Freight Road toward the staff parking structure, her scrubs still damp from a pediatric trauma 3 hours earlier, her shoes soaked through from the walk, carrying a coffee she hadn't had time to drink and a set of car keys she was already too exhausted to aim correctly at the door. She heard the silence, and then she heard the sound of someone trying to breathe through blood. She didn't think about it. That was the truth she'd never been fully comfortable with about herself. That in those moments, her brain simply skipped the part where normal people hesitate. Her feet moved before her mind issued any instruction. She rounded the corner of the freight access lane and saw them. 7 men arranged in a loose half-circle around a body on the ground, all of them armed, not one of them crouching down. The man on the ground was young. That was what hit her first. Younger than she'd expected, early 30s at most, wearing a charcoal dress shirt now soaked almost completely black from 3 entry wounds she could already map without touching him. One in the left shoulder, one below the right collarbone, one lower, left side, lateral. That one was the problem. That one was working on something important, and whoever had dragged him behind that concrete barrier had either saved his life or delayed the ending by maybe 12 minutes. "I'm a nurse," Serena said loudly, clearly, in the voice she used in emergency rooms when she needed people to believe she was the most competent person in the room, even when she was running on no sleep and cortisol and spite. Everyone moved back. Nobody moved. One of the men, heavy-set, short-cropped gray at his temples, a scar that ran from his left ear toward his jaw, stared at her the way people stare at someone who has just walked into a room where they clearly don't belong. "Lady," he said, "walk away." "I can't do that." She was already down on one knee beside the man on the ground, pressing her fingers to the lateral wound, feeling the warmth spread between them. "Do you have a first aid kit in any of those vehicles? A trauma bag? Anything?" Silence. The man on the ground opened his eyes. They were dark, almost black in this light, and despite the blood and the rain and the 3 holes in his body, what she saw in them wasn't fear. It was something closer to irritation, the look of a man who had planned his evening differently. "You should leave," he said. His voice was low and controlled, which told her he was still managing the pain rather than being managed by it, which meant his system hadn't yet gone into full shock, which bought her time. "I'm aware of that," Serena said. "Hold still." She stripped off her jacket without ceremony and pressed it against the lateral wound. "What's his blood type?" she asked the room. The heavy-set man with the scar was watching her now with something that might have been reassessment. "Oh, negative," someone said from the back. "Good. Universal donor means we're not working against it." She was running her hands across the man's torso with the clinical detachment she'd trained herself into over 8 years of emergency nursing, calling out what she found in her own head. Shoulder wound. Through and through, missed the subclavian based on pulse quality. Bleeding, but manageable. Collarbone entry. The bullet was still in there. She could feel the resistance, but the angle suggested it hadn't punched through to the lung because he wasn't presenting with a sucking chest wound and his breath sounds on that side, while diminished, were still present. The lateral wound was the issue. It had the quality she'd learned to recognize from too many Saturday nights in the trauma bay. Something abdominal, something proximate to the spleen, blood pressure dropping in the steady, quiet way that bodies drop blood pressure when they're preparing to quit without making a scene about it. He needs surgery, she said. Not an emergency room, a surgical suite immediately. Someone who can open him up and find what that third bullet nicked. She looked up at the heavy-set man. I'm assuming you have resources that aren't a 911 call. The man stared at her. You're assuming correctly, he said finally. Then make the call, right now, while I keep him alive long enough to get there. His name, she would learn later, in pieces, the way you learn things in that world, was Marcus Hale. He was the number 2 in an organization that didn't advertise itself, and he was accustomed to making decisions under pressure. He made one then. He pulled out a phone and walked 6 steps away and spoke in a voice too low to catch. And within 4 minutes, there was a black SUV backing down the access lane with a man inside who turned out to have field trauma training, which wasn't surgical but was better than nothing. Serena worked on that concrete for 11 minutes. She did not think about what kind of man she was keeping alive. She thought about the lateral wound and the dropping pressure and the improvised compression and the sound of his breathing, which stayed rough but consistent, which was what she needed from it. When they moved him to the SUV, she climbed in without being invited. You don't have to, Marcus began. Someone needs to monitor him in transit, she said, unless you have a better option. He didn't. She spent 4 hours in a private facility she'd never heard of, in a surgical support role for a physician who asked no questions and expected none in return. And when it was over and the man was stable and moved to a private recovery room, Serena sat in a white hallway on a white chair and drank terrible coffee from a vending machine and felt the adrenaline drain out of her the way it always did. Suddenly, completely, leaving behind something heavier than tiredness. Marcus Hale sat down across from her. He wants to see you, Marcus said. I need to get home, Serena said. He won't keep you long. She knew what she should have said. She should have said she'd done what she'd done and she didn't need acknowledgement and she was walking out. She told herself variations of that story her whole career, that she helped people because it was right, not because she expected anything, not because she needed the completion of some ending where the person she'd saved looked her in the eye. She went in anyway. The room was too clean to be a hospital room and too sparse to be anything comfortable. He was propped up at a slight angle, tubes running, monitors blinking, his color better than it had been on the concrete by a measure that meant something. His dress shirt was gone. The shoulder and collarbone wounds were dressed and taped. Someone had cleaned his face. He looked younger without the blood. He looked at her the same way he had on the concrete, assessing, contained, not particularly grateful, not particularly warm. A man who parsed everything that entered his field of vision for threat or utility and hadn't quite filed her yet. You're a nurse, he said. It wasn't a question. Trauma unit. Mercy General. Why didn't you walk away? Serena considered lying and decided it wasn't worth the energy. I don't know how to walk away from someone bleeding out. I've tried. It doesn't take. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, more like the registration of information he found unexpectedly relevant. Damien Cade, he said. She knew the name. She'd have had to have lived in a different city and paid attention to absolutely nothing not to know it. The Cade Syndicate controlled 1/3 of the port operations, owned politicians she'd voted for without knowing what she was doing, and had been investigated by 3 federal task forces in the last decade without a single conviction sticking. She didn't say any of that. Serena Vale, she said, you'll be compensated. That's not necessary. It is, he said. In my world, debts get settled. We don't have a debt, Serena said. I did my job. He looked at her for a moment with that same expression, like she was a variable he hadn't accounted for. All right, he said. Then you'll be protected. From what? From the people who did this deciding you're a liability. That landed differently than she expected. She hadn't thought past the medical problem to the problem on the other side of it, that she had just very visibly intervened in something she wasn't meant to see, and that the people who'd done the shooting might reasonably prefer she hadn't. How long? She asked. Until we've handled it. He said it the way people say it when handling means something very specific. She didn't ask what that meant. She had a reasonable idea. The protection was unobtrusive. She noticed it after the first 2 days. A car she'd seen too many times in the wrong places. A presence in her building she'd dismissed as a new tenant until she clocked the rotation. She didn't mention it. She went to work and came home and tried to forget the harbor and the concrete and the blood-soaked dress shirt and the eyes that had watched her from the ground without fear. She did not do this successfully. 3 weeks later, Marcus Hale called and asked if she'd be willing to consult on a medical situation. Discreetly. She said yes, and afterward was irritated with herself for how quickly she'd said it. It became a pattern, not a frequent one, twice more over the following month. Situations where someone in Damien Cade's orbit needed medical attention that couldn't be taken to a conventional facility, and where her particular combination of skills and demonstrated discretion made her useful. She went. She did the work. She was paid well, significantly better than her hospital salary, and each time she told herself it would be the last time. She wasn't naive about what she was participating in, even at the margins. She knew that the men she was treating hadn't received their injuries through ordinary misfortune. She knew that the facility she worked in operated entirely outside any licensing framework she'd been trained within. She knew all of this, and she went anyway, and she would have told you, if you'd pushed her, that she went because the work was real and the need was immediate and she was good at it. That would have been mostly true. The rest of the truth was Damien Cade himself, and she did not examine that part directly. The way you don't examine a structural problem in a building you're not prepared to vacate. The fourth time Marcus called, she arrived to find not a trauma patient, but a dinner. The room was a private dining space on the 40th floor of a building she hadn't known existed until she walked into it. Damien was standing at the window with his back to her, looking out at the city. He'd recovered fully in the physical sense. The shoulder moved correctly. The posture was straight. There was no visible evidence of the 3 holes she'd watched get closed. He was wearing a dark suit that fit the way expensive suits fit, which is to say, like it had been designed for his body specifically, and no concession had been made to anything else. He turned when he heard her and didn't say anything immediately, which she'd come to understand was a habit. He didn't fill silences out of social obligation the way most people did. Marcus said there was a medical situation, she said. There isn't. She set her bag down on the nearest chair. Then what is this? I wanted to have a conversation that wasn't about someone bleeding. That's the only context in which we've spoken. That's what I'm trying to change. He gestured toward the table. Sit down. She sat. Not because he'd told her to. She was clear with herself about that distinction. But because she was curious, and because her feet hurt, and because she'd decided in the elevator that if this became something she needed to leave, she would leave. The meal was better than anything she'd had in months. She was honest about that with herself, even while being guarded about most everything else. They actually talked, in the way that surprised her, about the city and the medical system and infrastructure, and the particular absurdity of trying to deliver decent health care to people who lived in districts where the funding had been systematically gutted. He knew more about it than she expected. He asked questions that were specific rather than performative. She didn't forget what he was. She just found that what he was didn't account for everything that he was, which was a more complicated problem. When she left that night, he walked her to the elevator. At the door she turned and found him closer than she'd registered, and the moment had the particular quality of moments that can go either way, when the air changes slightly and something decides itself before anyone consciously decides it. She went home. She lay in her apartment and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Mom. It happened 6 weeks later, on a night that wasn't planned by either of them. The particular kind of unplanned thing that becomes possible when 2 people have been carefully maintaining a distance and then find themselves, by circumstance and exhaustion and the accumulated weight of proximity, in a moment where the distance costs more energy than crossing it. She didn't stay. She gathered herself before morning and left in the particular silence of someone who needs to be gone before the reality of the situation settles into the room. She was a trauma nurse. She was practical. She did not allow herself illusions about men like Damien Cade, about what she was to him, about what a night like that signified in the architecture of his life. She drove home in the gray pre-dawn light thinking she was fine, thinking she was clear-headed, thinking she had this categorized correctly. She thought that for approximately 3 weeks. Then the world tilted on its axis. She was sitting on the edge of the bathtub in her apartment bathroom at 6:45 in the morning, looking at a small plastic test and understanding, in the steady, unavoidable way that you understand things that cannot be ununderstood, that her category system had been entirely wrong. She set the test down on the edge of the sink. She sat very still for a while. Outside, Chicago was waking up in its usual way. Traffic and horns and someone's radio 3 floors below. And none of it acknowledged that anything had changed. But everything had changed. She picked up her phone twice and set it back down. There was no version of this call she knew how to make. She barely knew this man. She knew him from blood and concrete and one dinner that had surprised her, and a single night she'd already been telling herself was a mistake. She knew his name from news reports about organizations that operated in the specific spaces between legality and something else entirely. She was a 32-year-old trauma nurse with a studio apartment and significant student debt and a job she loved and a life she'd built carefully from the ground up, and she was sitting on the edge of a bathtub in the early morning, understanding that nothing about the next several months was going to be what she had planned. She did not cry. That wasn't her nature. She sat with it and breathed with it, and then she got up and washed her face and made herself coffee, and she thought about what she was going to do. She had not reached any conclusions when her phone rang. Marcus Hale's name on the screen. She answered. "Mr. Cade would like to see you," Marcus said. "He has something to discuss." In the bathroom, on the back edge of the sink, the test sat where she'd left it. "I'll come in this afternoon," she said. She hung up. She looked at the test. She looked at it for a long time. She didn't know yet what Damien Cade wanted to discuss. She didn't know what had shifted in his world, what calculation had changed, what she was about to walk into. She knew only that she was carrying something she hadn't planned for, and that the man she was about to face was the most dangerous person she had ever been in a room with, and that somehow, despite every practical instinct she possessed, none of that knowledge was making her afraid. It was making her very, very quiet. She picked up the test and wrapped it in tissue and placed it in the trash. Then she got dressed. Then she went. She took the stairs, not because the elevator was broken, it wasn't, but because she needed the 90 seconds between the lobby and the 40th floor to exist as something other than what she was about to walk into. She needed the sound of her own footsteps, the mechanical rhythm of ascent, something physical to hold against the thing turning over and over in her chest that she was refusing to name. By the time she pushed through the stairwell door onto the executive level, her breathing was controlled. Her face was composed. 8 years of emergency nursing had given her the ability to walk into rooms where everything was wrong and present as though she had already decided how it ended. She used that now. Marcus was waiting in the corridor outside the main office. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her that first night on the concrete, measuring, recalibrating, and then he opened the door without saying anything, which was its own kind of message. The office was large and sparse, in the way of rooms where the person occupying them has decided they don't need to impress anyone. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a desk that was mostly clear, 2 chairs positioned across from each other at an angle that was not quite confrontational and not quite collaborative. Damien was standing at the window again, which she was beginning to understand was a position he defaulted to when he was managing something internally and didn't want the management to be visible. He turned when she entered. His face told her nothing, which was information in itself. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." Something tightened at the corner of his jaw. He moved to the desk and sat on the edge of it, not behind it, on the edge, which she recognized as a deliberate choice, a reduction of the formal distance, and she didn't know yet whether that was good or bad. "There's been a situation," he said, "regarding your position here." "I don't have a position here." "You've consulted for us 4 times. In certain circles, that's sufficient to establish association." He picked up a folder from the desk and set it back down without opening it. "Someone brought your name to people I'd prefer didn't have it." Serena kept her breathing even. "What kind of people?" "The kind that clean up loose ends?" He said it without particular inflection, which made it worse. "I've handled it. but it required a decision about what your arrangement with us actually is, formally. We don't have a formal arrangement. We do now. He looked at her steadily. It's the only thing that keeps you protected. People on the outside who might consider approaching you need to understand that you're not accessible, that touching you carries a specific cost. The room was very quiet. Outside, the city moved in its indifferent way 40 stories below them, and she thought about the test wrapped in tissue in the trash back in her apartment bathroom, and she thought about what she was carrying, and she thought about the particular insanity of this moment and how none of it was anything she had planned for. What does that mean formally? She said. It means a contract, a documented consultancy, medical advisory specifically. It gives you legitimate cover and it gives us legitimate grounds to extend protection. He paused. It also means you'd be required to relocate, closer, somewhere we can respond quickly if something develops. You're asking me to move. I'm telling you the situation. You can decline. And if I decline? Then the protection becomes significantly more complicated. She stared at him. Is this a negotiation or an ultimatum? It's an honest description of your options. Those two things can be the same as an ultimatum. For the first time in the conversation, something shifted in his expression. Not quite acknowledgement, but something proximate to it. He picked up a glass of water from the desk, drank from it, set it back down. You'd have a separate residence, he said. Your own space, complete autonomy in your personal life. The consultancy is the formal structure, not the reality of your day-to-day. And what's the reality of my day-to-day? He looked at her for a moment before answering, and she had the sense that he was making a decision about how much of the truth fit inside this conversation. That's something we'd have to define, he said. Serena was quiet for a moment, the folder on his desk, the window behind him, the city. I need time to think about it, she said. You have until tomorrow morning. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. Damien? She didn't turn around. The people who were told my name, were they connected to whoever ordered the hit on you in the harbor? A pause. Short, but there. Yes, he said. She nodded, once, to herself, and walked out. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her apartment in the dark, staring at the ceiling, running through it in the systematic way she ran through difficult situations. What she knew, what she didn't know, what the variables were, what happened in each scenario. It was the same process she used in triage. Identify the wound, identify the resources, identify the clock. The clock was the problem. Because the clock was running on two separate timelines now, and only one of them was visible to Damien Cade, and the other one, the one wrapped in tissue in the trash, was a variable she hadn't introduced into any calculation yet. And she knew with the particular certainty of someone who had survived by being honest with themselves that she could not make this decision honestly without factoring it in. She got up at 3 a.m. and sat at the kitchen table. She sat there until 6. When she called Marcus at 7:15 and said she'd accept the arrangement, she had decided exactly one thing. She would figure out the rest later. This was not her best decision-making. She knew that. She made it anyway. The residence they arranged for her was on the 12th floor of a building she had never been inside, 6 blocks from the Cade Syndicate's primary operations center. It was larger than her apartment by a significant margin, quiet in the way that buildings with serious security infrastructure are quiet, and furnished with the practical anonymity of a place that had been put together by someone who knew what a person needed, but not specifically what she, Serena Vale, might want. She brought her own things. Her books, the lamp from her bedroom that she'd had since graduate school, the photograph of her mother that she kept on the desk. She did not tell anyone at Mercy General where she was going. She submitted a resignation that said personal reasons, which was vague enough to be true. She did not tell Damien Cade about the pregnancy. She told herself this was a timing decision, that she needed to understand the situation better first, that there was no urgency because she was only 8 weeks along, and her body was handling it quietly, and nothing required immediate disclosure. These were true statements arranged in a way that allowed her to avoid the question underneath them, which was simpler and harder. She was afraid of what his face would look like when she told him, And she didn't know yet whether the thing she was afraid of seeing was indifference or calculation, and she wasn't sure which would be worse. Tess. 3 weeks into the arrangement, she understood something about Damien Cade that she hadn't understood before. That the version of him that had sat across the dinner table and asked intelligent questions about healthcare infrastructure was real, and the version that issued ultimatums about her living situation was also real, and neither of them was the complete picture. The complete picture was of a man who had built something enormous and brutal over a decade and operated entirely within its logic, and who was capable of moments of what she could only call genuine human recognition. Moments when he looked at her and she had the distinct sense of being seen, specifically, rather than assessed generally, and who then could turn around and speak about violence and leverage and the management of human beings the way other people talked about quarterly projections. She ate dinner with him 3 times that week. Not by formal arrangement. Marcus would call in the afternoon, offer the information neutrally, and she would say yes or she would say no. And twice she said yes, and once she said no, and he didn't comment on the pattern either way. The third dinner, she almost told him. She was watching him across the table. He'd been describing something about a port contract dispute, the kind of conversation that required her to hold 2 or 3 layers of what he was actually saying separate from what he was saying on the surface. And she had the thought, clear and sudden, that she was sitting across from the father of her child, while that person had no idea that was what he was. And the absurdity of it hit her like a physical thing. She set down her fork. He noticed. He always noticed. "What?" he said. "Nothing. You stopped eating and you're doing the thing where you breathe very carefully." "I breathe carefully all the time." "I'm a nurse." He looked at her with the particular quality of attention he sometimes directed at her that she found the most difficult to manage. Not aggressive, not cold, simply very, very present. "Something's on your mind," he said. "Several things are always on my mind." Serena. Just her name, in a specific register, and she felt the whole careful architecture of the conversation threaten to collapse. "I'm fine," she said. "Eat." He ate. He didn't push. She understood by now that this was another thing about him. He didn't push. He waited. He was the most patient man she had ever been in proximity to, which in her experience was either a quality of wisdom or a quality of control, and she hadn't yet determined which category his version fell into. She left that night without telling him. She went back to the 12th floor and sat on the edge of her bed and thought, not for the first time, about simply leaving, taking what she knew and going somewhere else and building something on her own terms. She thought about it for a long time. In the morning, she called her doctor and made an appointment. The appointment was on a Thursday. Marcus drove her. She told him it was a routine checkup. He didn't ask further, which was either professional courtesy or because Marcus Hale had access to information she didn't know about and had already drawn his own conclusions. The doctor confirmed what she already knew. 12 weeks. Everything progressing normally. A heartbeat on the monitor that was small and fast and entirely real, and she lay on the table listening to it with a steadiness she was manufacturing from the outside and a feeling underneath it that she didn't have a word for yet, something that sat between terror and a ferocious, almost violent kind of love, something that surprised her with its force. She drove back in silence. That afternoon, Damien called her directly for the first time, not through Marcus directly. "Come up," he said. "When?" "Now." She went up. "What?" The office had different people in it than usual. 3 men she hadn't seen before, standing with the particular quality of attention that suggested they were not there for a meeting about port contracts. Damien was behind the desk this time, which was the formal arrangement, the one that meant what was happening in this room was not personal. He looked at her when she entered and then looked at the 3 men and said, "Out." They left. He waited until the door closed. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He placed a photograph on the desk in front of her. She looked at it without touching it. A man she didn't recognize, mid-50s, in a restaurant somewhere. The photograph had the quality of surveillance work. "You know who this is?" Damien asked. "No." "His name is Victor Crane. He's been my consigliere for 11 years. He said it in a flat tone, the tone of someone reading out a diagnosis. 2 days ago, I received evidence from a source I trust completely that Victor has been receiving payments from the Delano family for the last 14 months. He paused. The hit on the harbor was not a Delano operation. It was coordinated from inside my organization. Serena was very still. Your own consigliere. My own consigliere. He said it without any particular emotion, which was a specific kind of emotion in itself. The same man who suggested I put you in a protected arrangement. He looked at her, meaning he knew exactly where you were, has known since the beginning. The weight of what he was saying settled over her slowly, the way cold settles. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because the arrangement changes. Effective tonight, you're moving. Different location, only Marcus and 2 others know where. Nothing on paper. He was already looking back at the photograph. And because you deserve to know that the thing you walked into on the harbor was larger and more complicated than I led you to believe, and I made a decision to simplify it for you that I shouldn't have made. This was as close to an apology as she suspected he came, delivered in the same register he used for information about port contracts, and she sat with that for a moment. What happens to Victor Crane? She said. That's being handled. That's not an answer. He looked at her directly. It's the only answer I have for you. She understood. She understood what handled meant in this context. She understood that she was sitting in a room with a man who was about to make a decision that she had no moral comfort with, and that she was living inside an arrangement that made her proximity to that decision unavoidable, and that the child growing inside her was this man's child, and that she had not told him, and that the accumulated weight of all of these things was becoming structurally unsupportable. She stood up. I need to tell you something, she said. His eyes came up to her face and stayed there. I'm pregnant, she said. 12 weeks. It's yours. The room was very quiet. She watched his face do something she had no framework for, a movement through several things in rapid succession, too fast to track cleanly, and then settling into a stillness that was absolute. He said nothing. She waited. He said nothing. I'm not asking you for anything, she said, and she kept her voice level, which cost her something. I'm telling you because you have a right to know. What you do with it is your decision. The silence stretched. Outside, Chicago moved at its indifferent 40-story remove. Finally, he said, Sit back down. I don't think so. Serena. The register again, the one that cost her something to hear. Please sit down. She sat. And then his phone rang. He looked at it. Something in his face changed, fast, sharp, the way a face changes when what appears on the screen is not what was expected, and the implication arrives before the mind has fully processed the information. He answered. He listened for approximately 10 seconds. When he lowered the phone, the man who had been sitting across from her with something almost open in his expression was gone, replaced by the version of Damien Cage she had seen only once before, on the concrete in the harbor. The one that was cold and precise and operating on a completely different frequency. Marcus is outside, he said. Go with him. Now. What's happened? Victor knows I have the evidence. He was already standing, already moving. He's making a move tonight. Go with Marcus. Damien, there's no time. He looked at her once, quickly, and in that look was something she couldn't name and didn't have the seconds to examine. We'll finish this conversation. I promise you that. But right now you need to go. She went. In the corridor, Marcus took her arm with a gentleness that was at odds with the pace he was moving at, and she let herself be moved because she understood that the window for independent decision-making had just closed, and that everything, the pregnancy, the conversation they'd been about to have, the future she hadn't yet been able to imagine, had just been set aside by the speed of the world Damien Cade operated in collapsing inward on itself. They were in the elevator when she heard it. 3 shots, somewhere above them in the building, then an alarm, then silence of the particular kind she recognized from the harbor. The silence that settles after something has already happened, and the only question left is what it has cost. Marcus pulled her against the wall of the elevator and placed his body between her and the doors, and she stood there in the small metal box, descending toward the lobby, with her hand pressed flat against her abdomen, breathing carefully, thinking with the clinical part of her mind that still functioned under extreme conditions. The 12 weeks was early enough that stress alone wouldn't cause harm, that her blood pressure was elevated but not critical, that she was physically safe. And thinking with the other part, the part underneath the clinical layer that she kept closed most of the time because it was inconvenient, that she had just told Damien Cage she was carrying his child, and that somewhere above her in this building someone was trying to kill him, and that she had no idea if she would ever finish that conversation. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby. Marcus said, "Move." She moved. The safe house was a brownstone in Pilsen that smelled like old paint and forced air heating, 4 rooms on the second floor above a dry cleaning business that Marcus said had been closed for 2 years. Serena sat on a folding chair in the kitchen with a cup of tea she hadn't asked for and wasn't drinking, listening to the building settle around her, listening to Marcus in the next room speaking in low, urgent syllables into his phone. Outside the window, a streetlight cast a narrow column of orange through the gap in the curtains. She could hear traffic. Normal traffic. The ordinary sound of a city that didn't know or care what had happened 40 stories up in a building 6 blocks east. She had her hand flat on the kitchen table. She was counting her own breaths. 3 shots. She'd heard 3 shots in the elevator. She didn't know what 3 shots meant in the specific accounting of whatever had happened up there, whether they meant Damien had fired them, or someone had fired them at Damien, whether the silence that followed was the silence of resolution or the silence of aftermath in the worst sense. Marcus hadn't told her anything. Marcus had put her in a car and driven in silence and brought her here and made tea with the automatic efficiency of a man performing routine protocol, and every time she'd started to ask, he'd said, "I'll have more information shortly," in a tone that meant stop asking. She was a trauma nurse. She knew how to wait inside uncertainty. She'd done it hundreds of times in corridors outside surgical suites, holding the space between not knowing and knowing with a steadiness that she'd learned was the most useful thing she could offer. She was less good at it when the uncertainty was personal. Marcus came into the kitchen. She looked at him. "He's alive," Marcus said. She let out a breath that she'd been holding in some form for the last 40 minutes. "Victor?" Marcus sat down across from her, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. Marcus was a man who stood. Standing was his resting state, the position from which he managed everything. When he sat, it was because the thing he was about to say required a different geometry. "Victor wasn't in the building," Marcus said. She frowned. "Then who?" "2 men. Victor's people." He set his phone face down on the table. "They got to the 3rd floor before security contained it. Damien wasn't touched." "But the shots?" "Security. Victor's people didn't come out of it." Serena absorbed that. The specifics of what that meant in the physical sense she filed in a compartment she'd built for exactly this purpose. The compartment where she put the things that were true and brutal and that she couldn't address from where she currently sat. "Where's Damien now?" she said, handling it. "Marcus. He's secure. That's what I can tell you." She looked at him for a moment. "Is there something else you're not telling me?" Marcus picked up his phone and turned it over once and set it back down. A small gesture, the kind she'd learned to read. Not evasion, specifically, more like the physical action of a man deciding how much of a thing to carry at once. "Victor didn't just make a move tonight because of the evidence," Marcus said. "The timing was specific. He moved tonight because of you." She went very still. "What does that mean?" "We intercepted a communication this afternoon, before you came up. Victor has a source inside the building, someone who feeds him information in real time. That source reported your arrival. Your conversation with Damien." He paused. "Specifically, what you told him." The kitchen was very quiet. "He knows I'm pregnant," she said. "Yes." She sat with that for a moment, turning it over, examining what it meant. "He moved tonight because of the pregnancy." A child changes succession dynamics, changes how Damien operates, what he protects, what risks he takes. Marcus kept his voice neutral, informational. From Victor's perspective, it changes the mathematics of a takeover. A man with a child is a man with a new kind of vulnerability. She understood. She understood completely. She set her tea down very carefully, making sure to place it exactly in the center of the ring it had already made on the table. He was waiting for something like this, she said. We think he's been waiting for a long time. She thought about the 14 months of payments Marcus had mentioned in the office. 14 months of someone sitting at Damien's right hand and quietly redirecting the architecture of the organization, slowly, patiently, in the way that the most dangerous kinds of damage happen. Not all at once, but so gradually that by the time the structure shows strain, the rot is already in the foundation. I need to see Damien, she said. In the morning. Tonight. Serena, tonight, Marcus. She looked at him with the expression she used when she needed someone to understand that she was not going to be managed. What I told him tonight is connected to everything that just happened. He needs to be able to think about it clearly, and he can't do that with it just hanging in the air between us. So I need to see him tonight. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. I'll make a call, he said. They drove for 20 minutes to a location she didn't recognize, a converted warehouse space in an industrial corridor near the river, the kind of building that looked abandoned from the outside and was very much not abandoned. Marcus walked her through 2 security checkpoints and down a corridor that smelled like concrete and machine oil, and left her in a room that had been set up as a temporary operations center, 4 monitors running surveillance feeds, a table covered in documents, 2 men she'd never seen working at laptops in the far corner. Damien was standing at the table. He looked up when she came in. He was still in the same suit from earlier. There was a cut above his left eyebrow that had been taped but not properly cleaned, the edges slightly dark with dried blood, and she registered it with the automatic professional cataloging she couldn't turn off even now. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, not the contained blankness, not the assessment, not the warmth he sometimes let through. Something rawer. Something that had been stripped back by the last 2 hours. You're all right, he said. I'm fine. She walked toward him. She stopped 2 feet away. Let me look at that. He didn't argue, which surprised her. He turned slightly to give her the angle, and she examined the cut. Superficial, the tape was sufficient, nothing that needed sutures, and then stepped back. It's fine, she said. Keep it clean. He nodded. She glanced at the men in the corner and looked back at him. He registered the look and said, Give us the room, without raising his voice, and they left. The door closed. You were going to say something, Serena said, before the call came in. You said we'd finish the conversation. I remember. So finish it. He moved away from the table and toward the window. The same instinct as always, the window, the position where he could see out without being easily seen, and stood there for a moment with his back to her. I wasn't prepared for it, he said. What you told me. I know. I don't mean I reacted badly. I mean, it moved something that I wasn't. He stopped, started again. I've run this organization for 10 years. I've made decisions about people's lives and calculated what things cost and what they were worth, and I've been good at it because I don't let things move me, not quickly. He turned. You moved me quickly. And then the phone rang, and I had to go somewhere else, and I'm asking you not to read the absence of a response as the response. She looked at him for a long time. What is the response? She said. I don't know yet, he said, but it isn't nothing. I need you to know that. She nodded once. She hadn't expected a declaration. She wasn't sure she would have trusted one. What he'd given her was more specific than a declaration. It was an honest account of his own internal state from a man who clearly found that kind of honesty expensive, and she valued it accordingly. We need to talk about what happens now, she said. Practically. Yes. Victor knows about the pregnancy. That changes what I am to him. You're a target, Damien said directly, without softening it. Yes. Which means the current arrangement isn't sufficient. The current arrangement is already being restructured. He came back to the table. We move you again. Somewhere Victor's network doesn't have lines into. We take you dark. No phone contacts except through secure channels. No movement patterns he can predict. For how long? Until Victor is handled. And how long is that? His jaw tightened fractionally. I'm working on a timeline. Damien. She waited until he looked at her. I'm asking because I'm pregnant, and I need prenatal care, and I need to be able to plan. And I'm working on a timeline isn't something I can build a plan around. He absorbed that. The practical specificity of it, the prenatal care, the planning, the ordinary human logistics of a pregnancy set against the extraordinary circumstances surrounding it, seemed to land in a way that the broader situation hadn't quite. 2 weeks, he said. We'll have enough of Victor's network mapped to move on him within 2 weeks. She nodded. Okay. I'll arrange a physician, someone I trust. You'll have access to whatever you need medically. Okay, she said again. They looked at each other across the table, covered in documents and surveillance photographs, and the operational detritus of a situation that was still unfolding, and she had the strange experience she sometimes had with him of seeing two things at once: the man who ran this organization and made these calculations, and the man who had said, "It isn't nothing. I need you to know that." And she didn't know yet how to hold both of those things without one canceling the other. She went back to the safe house. She did not sleep. The next 9 days had the quality of a held breath. She stayed in the Pilsen brownstone. Marcus brought her books she hadn't asked for, but was grateful for. A physician came twice. A woman, efficient and warm, who asked no questions about the circumstances and gave Serena the information she needed in the direct clinical language she preferred. Everything was progressing normally. She was 13 weeks. The nausea she'd been managing for the past month was beginning to ease. She spoke to Damien twice by phone, briefly, in the way that people speak when they are managing a situation together, and the situation is taking up most of the available space. He was methodical. He was making progress on Victor's network. She updated him on her medical situation, and he listened with an attentiveness she found she appreciated more than she'd expected. On the 10th day, Marcus came in the morning instead of the afternoon. Serena was sitting at the kitchen table with a book she hadn't been reading. She looked at his face when he came through the door and set the book down. "What happened?" she said. Marcus sat. Again, the sitting. "We found the source," he said. "The person inside who fed Victor the information about you, about the pregnancy." "Who?" Marcus put a photograph on the table. She looked at it. It was a woman, 40, perhaps. Dark hair pulled back, a face Serena didn't recognize. The photograph was a surveillance still, grainy, taken at an angle. "Her name is Lena Park," Marcus said. "She's been with the organization for 6 years, medical coordinator. She manages the medical staff in the private facility you've consulted in." Serena kept looking at the photograph. "She was the one who told Victor about you," Marcus continued. "From the beginning, from the harbor. She's the one who gave your name to the people who considered approaching you in the first week." The cold that moved through Serena was not surprise, exactly. Some part of her had understood since the safe house that the leak was close, was someone with specific access to specific information. But knowledge and understanding were different things. And understanding that someone had been watching her, feeding information about her, from the first night she'd walked into that facility. Understanding it made the last months rearrange themselves with a lurch, each memory acquiring a new depth, a new dimension of exposure she hadn't known was there. "Does Damien know?" she said. "He was told this morning." And Victor's position just became significantly worse. Marcus said it without expression. "Finding the source means we have someone who can map the rest of the network. Someone who has been in communication with Victor for 6 years. Serena thought about that, about Lena Park and 6 years of quiet observation, building a picture of the organization's vulnerabilities, its human infrastructure, its points of softness, about the particular patience of it. "Where is she now?" Serena said. "In custody." She didn't ask what custody meant in this context. She asked the thing she actually needed to know. What does she know about me? Specifically, what did she give Victor about me? Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Everything," he said. "Your medical records from the facility, your address before the move, your prenatal appointments." He paused. "The name of your doctor at Mercy General." The air in the kitchen changed. Her doctor at Mercy General was a woman named Dr. Anita Cho, who had been Serena's physician for 4 years, and who had no connection whatsoever to Damien Cade or the Cade Syndicate or any of this. A woman who had an office full of plants and a coffee mug that said World's OKS Doctor, that she'd received as a gift from a patient and kept for reasons of genuine affection. Has anyone contacted her? Serena said. We don't know. She stood up. We need to know, she said. Right now. We're working on Marcus. Her voice came out harder than she intended, and she didn't apologize for it. If Victor's people have been to her office, if they have her as a contact point, she is in danger because of me. Right now. So whatever working on it means, it needs to mean something in the next 10 minutes. Marcus was already on the phone. She stood in the kitchen and pressed her hands flat on the counter and breathed. In carefully. Out carefully. She thought about Dr. Anita Cho's office on the 4th floor of Mercy General's medical tower. The plants on the windowsill. The stupid, beloved coffee mug. The 4 years of appointments during which a decent woman had done her job with competence and kindness, and had absolutely no reason to be touched by any of this. Marcus lowered the phone. She looked at him. Her office was broken into last night, he said. Files accessed. She wasn't there. Where is she? We don't know. The counter was cold under her palms. She pressed harder. Find her, Serena said. Please. Marcus made another call. She stood there and held herself very still, because the alternative to stillness was a kind of rage she didn't have a clean outlet for. Rage at Victor Crane and his 14 months of patient sabotage, at Lena Park and her 6 years of watching and feeding information to someone who would use it to endanger ordinary people who had nothing to do with any of this, at herself for the decisions that had led her into proximity with all of it, and underneath all of it, underneath everything, the cold and specific knowledge that she had been naive in a way she was not accustomed to being naive. She had told herself she was clear-headed, that she understood the situation, that she was operating with her eyes open. She had been inside someone's collection of data for months without knowing it. Every appointment, every movement, every conversation within reach of Lena Park's access had been fed to a man who was now using it as leverage, and she had walked through all of it believing she was making autonomous decisions. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She looked at Marcus. He was still on his call. She answered. Ms. Vale, said a voice she didn't recognize. Male, mid-range, unhurried. The voice of a man who had decided the conversation was going to go the way he wanted it to go and wasn't particularly stressed about whether she agreed. My name isn't important. I'm calling on behalf of a mutual acquaintance. We have something of yours. She kept her voice flat. I don't know what you're talking about. Dr. Anita Cho, the voice said. She's fine. She'll stay fine. But she's going to need you to do something for us first. Serena gripped the phone. What? She said. We need you to leave the brownstone alone. Tonight. No Marcus, no security. Just you and an address I'll text you in 1 hour. A pause, measured and deliberate. If you bring anyone, Dr. Cho's situation changes. If you tell Damien Cade, her situation changes. If you're not at the address by 10 o'clock tonight, her situation changes. The kitchen. The streetlight through the curtains. The cold of the counter. If I come, she said, and I do what you're asking, she goes home. She goes home. You have my word. The word of a man working for Victor Crane, offered over an unknown phone number at 8 in the morning to a pregnant woman standing alone in a safe house kitchen. She looked at Marcus, still on his call, his back partially to her. She thought about Dr. Cho. She thought about 12 years of medical training and 8 years in a trauma bay and everything she'd built on the understanding that people who ended up in her care deserved to be protected, deserved to have someone in that room who was all the way present and not calculating what their safety was worth against something else. She thought about the baby. She thought about what walking into that address alone meant. All right, she said quietly. She hung up. Marcus turned around. She looked at him with the same expression she used in the trauma bay. Composed, directed, giving nothing away on the surface. Any news on Dr. Cho? She said. Not yet, Marcus said. I've got 2 people checking her home address. Okay, Serena said. I'm going to lie down for a while. Wake me if something comes through. She walked to the bedroom. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her phone and understood, with the same clear-eyed practicality she'd applied to every crisis she'd ever managed, that she was about to make the most dangerous decision of her life. Alone, without backup, at 10 weeks pregnant, walking into a location controlled by a man who had already tried to kill Damien Cade 3 times and failed, and who had just decided that the leverage he needed was standing in a Pilsen brownstone believing she was in a safe house. She was not afraid. That was the thing that frightened her, distantly. That she was not afraid. That the fear had been replaced by something colder and more precise. Something that felt like clarity, but might have been the particular kind of numbness that descends when the options have narrowed to exactly one, and the cost of it has been calculated and accepted. She looked at the time. 9 hours. She began to think about what she needed. She left at 9:15. The window in the bedroom bathroom was small but sufficient. She'd identified it on the second day, a habit she'd developed without consciously deciding to, the automatic mapping of exits, the same instinct that made her note defibrillator locations when she walked into unfamiliar buildings. She went through it onto a narrow ledge above the alley, dropped the 6 feet to the dumpster below, and was on the street in under 2 minutes. She walked 4 blocks east before she flagged a cab. She did not look back. The address the text had given her was in the Port District, but not the main harbor, but the older section to the south where the infrastructure dated from the 50s, and the city had been trying to redevelop for 30 years without meaningful result. Warehouses that had been built for a shipping economy that no longer existed in the same form, wide empty lots between them, the kind of darkness that accumulates in places where the streetlights are spaced too far apart. And nobody complains because nobody is supposed to be there at this hour. She had the cab drop her 2 blocks out. She walked the rest. The air off the water was cold and sharp, mid-November cold, the kind that found the gaps in your clothing and settled in. She was wearing what she'd worn that morning, jeans and a dark jacket, and she had her phone in one pocket, and in the other pocket the small folding knife she'd kept in her nursing bag for 3 years and never used, which she was under no illusion would be useful against multiple armed men, but which her hands needed to hold on to something that wasn't the phone. She found the building from the address, a loading facility that still had painted lettering on its side, faded to the point of illegibility, 2 freight doors that had been rolled down and a personnel door to the left that stood slightly open, light bleeding from the gap. She stopped 10 feet from the door. She breathed. She was not afraid. She had established that in the bedroom. What she was, standing in the November dark 10 feet from a door she needed to walk through, was very precisely aware of the weight of what she was carrying. Not just the pregnancy, not just her own life, but the specific moral gravity of having chosen this without telling anyone, without backup, without the safety net of Marcus or Damien or anyone who might complicate the exchange, but might also be the difference between walking out and not walking out. She'd made the calculation. Dr. Anita Cho, who grew plants and kept a stupid coffee mug, and had given Serena 4 years of competent care. On one side. On the other side, the risk of bringing Damien Cade's resources into a situation where Victor Crane would use Dr. Cho as the instrument to make that go wrong. She'd made the calculation and she'd come alone, and she was not second-guessing it now, standing in the dark with a folding knife and a phone, because second-guessing it now was not a luxury she'd purchased. She walked through the door. The interior was what she'd expected, the raw bones of industrial space, concrete floor stained with decades of freight traffic, ceiling lost in shadow above the reach of the 4 work lights that had been set up in a rough square near the center of the floor. The light was harsh and directional, the kind that creates deep shadow at its edges and bleaches out everything it hits directly. Dr. Anita Cho was sitting in a chair in the center of that light. She was upright, uninjured as far as Serena could assess from the distance. No blood, no visible distress beyond the rigid set of her shoulders and the way her hands were gripping the chair arms. Her eyes found Serena immediately. Something moved in them. Relief. And then, quickly, something complicated that wasn't quite relief anymore. 2 men stood behind her. A third was to Serena's left, closer, which was the one she'd clocked first because he was in her peripheral line when she came through the door. And at the far edge of the light, sitting on the edge of a freight table with the specific unhurried quality of a man who had arranged this and was now observing it, was Victor Crane. She recognized him from the surveillance photograph. Mid-50s, the careful grooming of a man who managed his presentation with the same attention he gave to everything else. He looked like someone's senior partner at a law firm, which she understood was entirely intentional. He looked at her the way people look at something they've been reading about and are now seeing in person. "Ms. Vale," he said, "you came alone." "I came alone," she said. "Good." He stood, not hurried, not aggressive, the movement of a man in his own space following his own timing. "I appreciate the cooperation. It simplifies things." "Let her go," Serena said. That was the arrangement. In a moment, he walked toward her slowly, staying outside the direct beam of the work lights, which kept his expression in partial shadow. "I wanted to speak with you first, without Damien's people filtering the conversation. You could have called." "I did call." A measured pause. "This is the follow-up." He stopped 8 feet from her. Behind him, Dr. Cho's eyes were tracking Serena with a specific intensity, the look of someone trying to communicate without language, and Serena received it and filed it without changing her expression. "What do you want?" Serena said. "I want you to understand something," Victor said. "Not as a threat, as context." He clasped his hands behind his back, which was the gesture of a man giving a presentation he'd rehearsed. "Damien Cade is not what you believe he is. Not the version he's shown you. I know exactly what he is. You know what he's chosen to show a woman he wanted." Victor's voice was patient, almost kind, in the way that made her skin tighten. "You don't know what he's capable of when something he's built is threatened. You don't know what he's done to protect this organization, not the abstractions, the specifics, the people who stop being convenient." He let that sit for a moment. "The child you're carrying will be a currency in his world, not a person, a leverage point, something he uses to consolidate his position when the time is right." Serena kept her face still. "That's a very specific story," she said. "It's his history. I've watched it for 11 years. You've also been taking payments from the Delano family for 14 months. She watched something move in his face, fast, quickly controlled. "So your perspective on Damien's history comes with a conflict of interest." The patience in his expression thinned by a fraction. "Where did you—" "Damien told me," she said. "He tells me things, which is more than I can say for the man who had me under surveillance for months without my knowledge." The silence between them changed quality. Victor looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite reassessment, more like the recognition that the variable he'd introduced into the situation had different properties than the ones he'd planned for. "Let her go," Serena said again, flat, unarguable. "Now." Victor looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded to the man behind Dr. Cho. The man cut the zip ties at her wrists. Dr. Cho stood immediately. She was steady on her feet, which told Serena she hadn't been physically harmed, and walked towards Serena with the directed movement of a woman who was managing her own fear with everything she had, and doing it well. Serena touched her arm when she reached her. "You're okay?" "I'm okay." Her voice was tight but controlled. "Serena, they know—" "I know," Serena said quietly. "Walk to the door. Don't run. Walk." Dr. Cho walked. Serena watched her go, tracking her peripheral vision until she heard the personnel door open and close. She looked back at Victor. "There," he said. "Done." He spread his hands slightly. "Now we can have the rest of the conversation." "There is no rest of the conversation," Serena said. "I came for her. She's gone. I'm leaving." "I don't think so." His voice didn't change. Same patient register. But the man to her left moved, not toward her, just a shift of weight, a repositioning that closed off the line to the door by about 4 feet. "You're going to be here for a little while longer, because Damien Cade is going to come looking for you when he realizes you left the brownstone, and when he does, I need him to come here." The cold that moved through her was entirely different from the cold outside. "You used her to get me here," she said, "and you're using me to get him here." "I'm resolving a situation," Victor said, cleanly, without protracted conflict that damages everyone. He sat back on the freight table. "Damien is going to walk through that door in—" he checked his watch. "Approximately 20 minutes. Because Marcus will have discovered you're gone by now, and Marcus will find the text on your phone if he looks, and Marcus will tell Damien, and Damien will come himself because that is what Damien does. He comes himself. Something moved in Victor's expression. Old, specific, complicated. It's always been his greatest flaw. Serena's mind was running very fast underneath the stillness she was maintaining on the surface. 20 minutes, if Victor's timeline was accurate. Damien walking into a building Victor controlled with however many men were currently in and around this facility. A confrontation on Victor's terms, on Victor's ground, with Serena as the circumstance that had delivered him here. She looked around the room with the particular systematic attention she was capable of when the stakes required it. 4 work lights. The freight table Victor was sitting on. 3 visible men, which meant an unknown number outside or in the building's other sections. The personnel door through which Dr. Cho had just left. A second door deeper in the warehouse, partly open, darkness beyond it. "You're going to kill him," she said. Not a question. "I'm going to resolve a leadership transition," Victor said, "which has been necessary for some time. The organization has been poorly managed. I have the contacts, the infrastructure, and the patience to run it correctly. All I've lacked is the opportunity. And I'm the opportunity. You're the circumstance," he said. "Don't take it personally. You seem like an intelligent woman who made an unfortunate choice of which life to involve herself in. After tonight, you'll be free to go wherever you like. The organization will have no further interest in you." She looked at him. "You'll let me go," she said flatly. "You have my word." She'd heard that phrase from him once before tonight, and she understood what it was worth, and she also understood something else, that Victor Crane believed his own reassurances, that he was not a man who considered himself a liar because he had constructed a framework in which his actions were organizational necessities rather than the choices of a particular human being with particular motivations. She understood this because she'd spent 8 years in emergency rooms where she'd met this type with some regularity, the man who caused damage and experienced himself as a neutral instrument of circumstances. She glanced at the man to her left. She glanced at the second door. She looked back at Victor. "Can I sit down?" she said. "I've been on my feet." Something in his face softened fractionally. The response of a man who had decided he was the rational one in this situation and was willing to extend small courtesies that confirmed it. "Of course," he said, and gestured toward a freight crate to her right. She moved toward it. In moving toward it, she moved slightly away from the man on her left, slightly closer to the work light nearest the second door, and she was cataloging the exact position of every person in her field of vision with the same focused attention she brought to a trauma scene when she needed to know where everything was before she could begin. She sat. She put her right hand in her jacket pocket. Her phone was there. She had sent one text from the cab on the way here, not to Marcus, not to Damien, to a number Marcus had made her memorize during the first week at the Brownstone, the secure operations line that he'd said to use only if she was in an emergency and couldn't reach him directly. She'd sent the address. Nothing else. Just the address and the time, 9:45. She didn't know if it had gone through. She didn't know if anyone had seen it in time. She didn't know if the 20 minutes Victor was estimating were Damien's 20 minutes, or someone else's, or nobody's. She sat on the freight crate with her hand around her phone in her pocket, and she waited, and she was calm, and she was very afraid, and both of those things were true simultaneously in the way that extreme situations allow. She thought about the heartbeat she'd heard on the monitor, small and fast and entirely real. She thought, "I am not going to let this be where it ends." 16 minutes later, the freight doors blew in. Not an explosion, a ram, something heavy driven through the roll-down mechanism at speed, the metal shrieking and folding inward with a sound that was enormous in the enclosed space, and then the lights went out, all 4 work lights simultaneously. Complete darkness. Serena dropped off the crate and went flat on the floor in the same movement, instinct ahead of conscious thought, her cheek against the cold concrete, pressing herself against the base of the crate. She heard shouting, Victor's men, multiple voices, disoriented, and then the hard, flat sound of a flashbang somewhere in the space beyond the freight doors, the light of it visible even from the floor through the gap under the crate, the sound of it enormous, and then the shouting changing register to something pained and confused. She stayed down. She counted. She had learned in the trauma bay that in a chaotic environment, the people who tried to move through everything got hurt more often than the people who found solid cover and stayed in it until they understood what was moving and what wasn't. She applied this now. Her heart was hammering, and she breathed against the concrete, and she did not move. Gunfire. 2 shots, then 3 more, from different positions. The acoustic signature of the large space making it hard to locate. Men's voices. Commands in a tight-clipped register she recognized as Marcus, somewhere near the freight doors. Then a sound very close to her. Footsteps. Fast. Wrong direction. A hand on her arm in the dark. She drove her elbow back hard, the way she'd been taught in a self-defense course 7 years ago that she had never expected to use. She connected with something solid. A grunt. "It's me." Damien's voice, low and tight. "Stop." She stopped. He pulled her up by the arm to a crouch, kept his hand there, and moved them both in the dark toward the wall. She could feel him navigating by memory or by something else, some operational familiarity with moving in darkness that she didn't have, and she let herself be moved because this was not a moment for autonomy. This was a moment for trusting the person who knew what they were doing. They got to the wall. He pressed her against it, his body angled to put himself between her and the open space of the warehouse. And she could hear his breathing, controlled, fast, the breathing of a man who had been running and was managing the physical load of it. "How many?" he said in her ear. "I counted 3 inside. Don't know the outside." "We have the outside." A pause during which she heard more shouts from the far end of the warehouse, movement, the tactical sound of the situation being managed by people who knew how to manage it. "Victor." Center of the room when the lights went out. Freight table, roughly. She oriented in the dark. 11 o'clock from here. Damien was quiet for 2 seconds. "Stay against the wall," he said. "Don't move until I come back." "Damien?" "Stay here." He was gone before she could finish, absorbed into the dark with a quietness that was startling for his size. She stayed against the wall. She put both hands flat on the concrete behind her. She listened. More movement across the warehouse. A single shot. Then silence of a specific kind, the held silence of a standoff. 2 positions in the dark, each knowing where the other approximately was, and neither wanting to move first into the disadvantage. Then Victor's voice, from somewhere in the dark near where she'd estimated, "You came alone." Damien, from a position she couldn't locate. "I came alone. I can hear your people at the freight doors. They're staying there. This is between you and me." A pause. "It didn't have to be this way," Victor said. "I've been with this organization 11 years. I built half of what you think you built. I know what you built." Damien's voice was very flat. "I also know what you took down. The harbor wasn't the first time." Silence. "Mateo Reyes," Damien said. 2 years ago, the Delanos paid you to give them his location." Serena pressed harder against the wall. "Mateo was a liability. Mateo was 26 years old, and he'd been with us since he was 17, and he trusted you." The flatness in Damien's voice had acquired an edge now, something underneath the control. "You gave him to people who put him in the river. I made a decision for the organization. You made a decision for yourself," Damien said. "You've been making decisions for yourself for 14 months and calling them organizational decisions. That's done now." A sound, movement, Victor relocating, and then a beam of light from somewhere, a tactical flashlight, catching Damien for a half-second before he moved. And in that half-second, Serena saw him clearly. Suit jacket gone, shirt dark with something that might have been water from the cold outside, or might have been something else, moving between pieces of freight equipment with the low-controlled speed of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Victor fired. The shot was wide. She heard it hit metal, somewhere to Damien's left. And then the flashlight went out, and the darkness was complete again. Serena moved. She didn't plan it. Or she planned it in the way she planned things in the trauma bay, when the situation changed faster than deliberate thought, her body already moving while her mind was still catching up to the decision. She pushed off the wall and went toward the freight table where she'd been sitting, where she knew the layout because she'd mapped it while Victor was talking, where the second work light had been on its stand before the lights went out. She found the stand in the dark by running her hands along the floor. She found the base, She found the cable. She followed the cable to the power strip and hit every switch on it. 4 lights came on simultaneously, harsh, blinding, catching everything. Victor was 6 feet from Damien with a gun leveled. Damien was behind a steel freight container, partially exposed. His own arm extended with something in his hand that took her 1 second to register was also a weapon. Both of them froze in the sudden light. Both of them adjusted. And in the 2 seconds of adjustment, Damien closed the distance. Not toward Victor's gun, but at an angle that took him out of the direct line. The movement fast and flat and decisive. And the gun went off. She heard the shot. She saw Damien stagger. Not down. He didn't go down. But the stagger was real, his left side, and he hit the freight container with his shoulder and used it to keep upright. And even from where she was standing, she could see the dark spreading below his ribs on the left side. And she felt the clinical part of her brain kick in immediately, involuntarily, cataloging. Damien straightened. He looked at Victor. Victor looked at the gun in Damien's hand. "Drop it," Damien said. "Just that." The warehouse was very quiet. Victor looked at Damien's face, at whatever was in it, and something in his own face changed, moved through several things, and settled. He dropped the gun. It clattered on the concrete with a sound that was enormous in the silence. Marcus and 2 others came through the freight opening at a run. More lights, flashlights, cutting across the warehouse, finding the remaining of Victor's men on the floor, finding Victor standing with his hands now rising, finding Damien still upright against the freight container with his hand pressed to his left side. Serena was already moving. She crossed the floor in the time it took Marcus to reach Victor, and she reached Damien and put her hands on him before he could deflect them, pulling his hand away from his side and replacing it with her own, pressing hard, reading the wound through the pressure the way she'd read 100 wounds on 100 different floors in 100 different emergencies. "How bad?" he said. "I need light, and I need better access," she said. "Sit down." "I can sit down." She met his eyes. He sat. She worked in the harsh light of the warehouse floor, using what Marcus produced from a vehicle outside. A trauma kit, military grade, better than she'd hoped for. And she talked through what she was doing in the low clinical voice she used when she needed to stay in the task and not in the circumstances surrounding the task. Through and through, left lateral. Again, the same region as the harbor, though higher, missing the spleen this time. The angle had been different. Bleeding was significant, but not arterial. She packed the wound with what she had and applied compression and told him clearly what she was telling him, that he needed surgery, that she could manage the bleeding but not the internal assessment, that he had time if they moved now. He listened to all of this looking at her face rather than at what her hands were doing. "You turned the lights on," he said. "Yes." "You were supposed to stay at the wall." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. His color was poor, but his eyes were clear, which was what she needed them to be. "The text," he said. "The address. You sent it before you came in." "Yes." "To the operations line." "Yes." He looked at her. "You planned for this," he said. "I planned for the possibility that I might need someone to know where I was," she said carefully, still working. "I wasn't planning for a rescue. I was planning for a fallback." "There's a difference?" "There's always a difference," she said. "Hold still." He held still. Across the warehouse, Marcus had Victor Crane in restraints and was speaking quietly into his phone with the focused brevity of a man coordinating something that had many moving parts. The other men, Victor's people, were secured on the floor. 2 of Damien's people she didn't recognize were moving through the warehouse, checking the space methodically. Serena finished the compression dressing. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was looking at her with that expression, the one she'd first seen on the concrete in the harbor, stripped back, not performing anything, just looking. "The baby," he said quietly. "Is fine," she said. "I stayed flat on the floor. No impact, no fall. Blood pressure's elevated, but within a manageable range. You know that. I'm a nurse, Damien. I know that." Something moved in his face. Something she would have called relief if she'd been prepared to believe the relief was as large as it looked. "We need to get you to a facility," she said, using the clinical voice to hold herself together. "You have a wound that needs surgical assessment, and you've lost enough blood that I'm not having any other conversation with you until that's handled." "All right," he said. "I mean it." "I hear you." She stood and called for Marcus and began telling him what was needed in the specific operational language she'd developed over the months of working in their world. And Marcus moved with the efficiency she'd come to rely on. And it was only when she turned back to Damien and found him watching her with that same expression that she felt the first tremor move through the control she'd been holding. She didn't let it through. Not here, not yet. She had a patient to stabilize and a warehouse floor to manage, and somewhere in this city, Dr. Anita Cho was making her way home, and that was one thing Serena had been responsible for and had gotten right. And she was going to hold that and move forward and allow herself whatever she was going to feel about tonight only when tonight was over, and the person she was responsible for was in a surgical suite, and she could sit in a white hallway and drink terrible coffee and be, for 10 minutes, something other than the most competent person in the room. The vehicles were outside. She walked Damien toward the freight doors with her shoulder under his arm and his weight against her, and outside the November air hit them cold and clean off the river, and the city was dark and enormous in every direction, and she thought that somewhere in the middle of all of this, the blood and the warehouse and the darkness and the choice she'd made to walk through that door alone, something had been decided that she hadn't consciously decided. She wasn't leaving, not the city, not the situation. She didn't know yet what that meant in practical terms, in the terms of what kind of life she could build and what kind of man Damien Cade would become on the other side of whatever was about to happen to his organization. She didn't know what came after Victor Crane and the Delano family and the 14 months of quiet rot that had hollowed out the inside of something she'd walked into on the worst possible night. She knew only that she was still here, and that the heartbeat on the monitor had been small and fast and entirely real, and that the man leaning on her shoulder was bleeding through a dressing she'd applied on a warehouse floor and was alive because of decisions both of them had made tonight with full knowledge of the cost. The vehicle door opened. She helped him in. She climbed in after him, kept her hand on the dressing, monitored his breathing in the dark, and watched the harbor district move past the window as they drove away from it, the river going black and cold on one side, and the city going lit and indifferent on the other, and she let herself, for just a moment, close her eyes. The surgery took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Serena knew, because she watched the clock on the wall of the private facility's waiting corridor. The same corridor she had sat in once before, after the harbor, drinking bad coffee from a vending machine and feeling the adrenaline drain out of her like water from a cracked vessel. She sat in the same chair. She drank the same bad coffee. She noticed this with the distant part of her mind that was still capable of noticing things, the part that wasn't occupied with the steady mechanical work of keeping herself together until she had reason to come apart. Marcus sat across from her for the first hour. He didn't speak. She was grateful for this. At the 2-hour mark, he brought her a sandwich from somewhere and set it on the chair beside her without comment. She ate half of it because she was 14 weeks pregnant and the baby needed food, even if she was not hungry, even if her stomach was a tight-closed thing that wanted nothing, even if the smell of the facility's antiseptic hallway was doing things to her nausea that the second trimester was supposed to have resolved, but apparently hadn't resolved tonight. She ate the half sandwich. She watched the clock. At 3 hours and 40 minutes, a physician she knew, the same one who had operated on Damien after the harbor, the one who asked no questions, came through the surgical suite door and told her that the wound had been clean, that the internal damage was manageable, that he had lost blood but not a critical volume, and that he would be in recovery for several hours, and she could see him when he was awake. She thanked the physician. She sat back in the chair. She put her face in her hands for exactly 30 seconds. Then she straightened up and finished the other half of the sandwich. Set. He was awake by 3 in the morning. The recovery room was the same sparse white space as before. Same monitors, same quality of enforced stillness, same insufficient lighting that made everyone in it look slightly worse than they were. He was propped up at the same slight angle. His color was better than it had been in the vehicle, which was the first thing she checked, the automatic clinical assessment she couldn't turn off. He looked at her when she came in. "You should sleep," he said. His voice was rougher than usual, the post-anesthesia quality she recognized. "I will," she said. She pulled the chair close and sat. How's the pain? Managed. On a scale. 4? A pause. 5. Honest. I'm trying something new. She almost smiled. She kept it contained. She looked at his face, at the specific exhaustion in it that wasn't physical, that went deeper than the surgery and the blood loss. The exhaustion of a man who had spent the last several hours on the other side of a moment he had been moving toward for 14 months and was now sitting in the aftermath of it, with everything that had driven him forward suddenly gone, and only what came next left to figure out. "Victor," she said. "In federal custody." His eyes moved to the ceiling. "Marcus made the calls I asked him to make. The financial records, the trafficking documentation, the communications between Victor and the Delano family. It went to the right people through the right channels. Anonymous, but specific enough to be actionable." He paused. "It's enough. They'll build a case that doesn't need me to testify to stick." "And the rest of the organization?" A silence that was longer than the others. "I've been thinking about that since the harbor," he said finally. "Since before the harbor, if I'm being honest. Which I'm also trying." He looked at her. "The syndicate doesn't survive this. Victor's network is too embedded in the operational structure. Pulling it out leaves something that isn't viable. And I'm not—" He stopped. Started again. "I built something because I knew how to build it. And because it was the world I understood. I don't know if I can tell you I built it for good reasons. I built it because I could." She said nothing. She let him find the rest of it. "The child changes the calculation," he said. "Not the way Victor thought. Not as a leverage point." His jaw moved. As a question, what kind of world does he come into? What does the man who made it owe him? Serena looked at her hands in her lap. "What are you saying?" she said. "I'm saying the organization ends." He said it without drama, without the weight of performance, the flat statement of a decision already made. The assets that can be liquidated legally will be. What I have left after that goes into things that are legitimate. I'll give the federal investigators everything they need about the trafficking routes, all of it. Whatever comes from that for me, whatever they decide to do with someone who cooperates completely, I'll accept. She looked up at him. "You could go to prison," she said. "Yes." "For years." "Possibly." He met her eyes. "I'm not asking you to wait. I want to be clear about that. I'm not giving you this information as a way of asking for something in return." "Then why are you telling me tonight, like this?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because you turned the lights on," he said. "In the warehouse. You were supposed to stay at the wall, and you turned the lights on, and I need you to understand that I know what that cost you to do, what you were risking, and that it matters to me. That you matter to me. In a way that I don't have a clean language for yet, but that I'm not going to leave unsaid because I've been leaving too many things unsaid for too long, and it has cost me things I can't recover." The recovery room was very quiet. The monitors blinked their steady, patient rhythms. She thought about the harbor and the concrete and the blood-soaked dress shirt and the eyes that had watched her from the ground without fear and asked her why she hadn't walked away. She thought about that first dinner 40 stories above the city and the conversation about healthcare infrastructure that had surprised her. She thought about the brownstone kitchen and Dr. Cho's face and a folding knife she'd never used and a warehouse floor and the sound of a heartbeat on a monitor, small and fast and entirely real. "I know," she said. He waited. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Whatever the legal process looks like, whatever the timeline is, I'm not going anywhere. But I need you to understand something from me. All right. If you do this, if you cooperate fully, if you give them everything, it has to be because it's the right thing, not for me, not for the baby, because it's the right thing." She looked at him steadily. "The moment it's a transaction, the moment you're doing it to get something, to build a story about yourself that you can give me, it means nothing. I've seen enough of this world now to know the difference." He looked at her for a long time. "It's not a transaction," he said. "How do I know that?" "You don't," he said. "Not tonight. I can't give you certainty tonight." He paused. "I can give you the truth that I don't know who I am outside of what I've built, and that the idea of finding out is the most frightening thing I've encountered in a decade of operating in a world that is not short on frightening things. And that the child, our son, Marcus, told me, I asked him to find out the result of your appointment, that he is the reason I am finally willing to be frightened. She absorbed the word. Son. She had known. She'd known since the Thursday appointment and hadn't said it aloud to anyone, keeping it private in the way she kept most private things, carrying it alone in the particular self-sufficient manner that was her nature, and also she had come to understand her limitation. She said, his name. Damien looked at her. When the time comes, she said, I want him to have a name that belongs to himself, not to the organization or to what you were, something he can carry without it weighing him down. Damien was quiet for a moment. You choose, he said. We'll choose together, she said. Later. He nodded. She reached across and put her hand over his, the one that wasn't connected to the IV line, and she felt his fingers close around hers with a grip that was careful, careful of the pregnancy, careful of her, careful in the specific way of a man who was learning a different kind of force than the one he'd spent 10 years practicing. She stayed until he fell asleep. Then she went out to the corridor and called Marcus and asked him to take her back to the brownstone, and he did, in silence, through the empty 4 o'clock streets of Chicago, moving in the blue pre-dawn dark. The legal process was not clean. She had not expected it to be clean. She had grown up practical, the daughter of a woman who had worked 2 jobs and paid her bills on time, and told Serena once, when Serena was 12 and furious about some injustice at school, that the world did not give out prizes for being right. It gave out results, and results were the product of sustained effort in the direction of something real, and the sooner she understood that, the better equipped she would be. She had understood it. She applied it now. The federal investigation consumed the better part of 4 months. Damien was not arrested immediately. The cooperation agreement his attorneys negotiated bought a period of supervised engagement during which he provided testimony and documentation on a scale that the lead investigator, a woman named Reyes who called Serena once by accident and apologized with the terseness of someone unaccustomed to making personal calls, described in a press release as unprecedented in scope and specificity. Trafficking networks, Port Authority corruption. 3 municipal officials and 1 federal contractor who had been on Cade syndicate payrolls. Victor Crane's 14 months of payments and the earlier history Damien had referenced, the year before the harbor, the decisions that had been made about people who stopped being convenient. It was not a small reckoning. Serena watched it from the particular vantage of someone who was simultaneously inside the story and trying to maintain the clarity of someone outside it. She moved out of the protected brownstone. It no longer served a purpose, and found an apartment in Logan Square. 3 rooms, south-facing, with enough light in the mornings that she could sit at the kitchen table with coffee and feel, for the hours before the day became complicated, that she was simply a woman in an apartment in a city preparing for a child. She went back to medicine. Not Mercy General, that was over. Too much had happened in proximity to it for it to be a clean return. But a community clinic in Pilsen, 4 blocks from the brownstone that had been her safe house, a place that served families in the specific way that mattered to her, without the gatekeeping of insurance infrastructure, without the bureaucratic triage that separated the people who could afford to be sick from the people who couldn't. She was hired on the basis of her Mercy General record and a reference from the clinic director who asked no questions about the gap in her employment and never mentioned it again. She worked. She got larger. She came home and ate reasonable food and slept the complicated sleep of late pregnancy and called her mother twice a week and did not tell her mother more than she needed to know. Damien came to the clinic once, during this period. He was not supposed to be unsupervised outside certain parameters of the cooperation agreement, and this visit existed in a gray area of those parameters that his attorney would have disliked. He stood outside on the sidewalk when her shift ended, and he looked like a man who had made a decision and was executing it, rather than someone who had drifted into the neighborhood by accident. She stopped when she saw him. She looked at him for a moment. "You're outside your radius," she said. "I know. Your attorney. I know." He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, not performing anything, just present on the sidewalk in the November cold that was cycling back around, a year now from the harbor. He looked at her. At the visible pregnancy? At her face? At the whole situation of her standing in front of him in her coat with her clinic badge still on and her feet aching from 8 hours on the floor? I wanted to see you. She looked at him for another moment. Come inside, she said. It's cold. He came inside. They sat in her small office, the one with the window that faced the street, where she'd put the lamp from her graduate school apartment and the photograph of her mother. And she made bad coffee from the clinic's ancient machine and gave him a cup and sat across from him at her desk, and they talked for an hour and 20 minutes. She would not have been able to reconstruct the conversation precisely afterward. It covered the legal timeline and the apartment and the clinic and the name they still hadn't chosen, and a moment 3 weeks earlier when she had felt the baby move for the first time in a way that was unmistakable, a real deliberate movement rather than the fluttering she'd been second-guessing since week 16. And she told him this because he was the father, and he deserved to know. And the expression on his face when she described it was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. When he left, he paused in the doorway. Serena, he said. She looked up. I'm sorry, he said. For the harbor. For the arrangement I put you in before I understood what I was doing. For the months of making decisions about your safety without... He stopped. I'm not doing this well. You're doing it fine, she said. I want to do it better. Then you will, she said. Go home before your attorney calls. He went. She sat in the office for a while after he left, in the quiet of the emptied clinic, and she allowed herself fully, finally, without the management she'd been applying, to feel the full weight of the year, the harbor, and the cold concrete, and the choice to kneel down beside a stranger bleeding out. The 4 consultations that had become a dinner that had become a night she'd tried to categorize. The bathroom floor and the test wrapped in tissue, and the subsequent months of carrying a secret that had grown larger than the decision to keep it. The brownstone and the safe house and the warehouse, and her hand on the power strip in the dark. The surgical suite and the recovery room, and the hand closing over hers with the careful grip of a man learning a different kind of force. She let herself feel all of it. Then she turned off her office light and went home. Liam was born on a Thursday in February. He arrived with the particular urgency of someone who has decided the exterior world can no longer wait, which was 3 weeks ahead of his estimated date, and caused a scramble that Serena managed with the focused practicality she applied to everything, calling her clinic director and her mother, and the secure number for Damien's attorney in that order. Damien was there within 2 hours. He had navigated the cooperation agreement parameters with something close to desperation, based on what his attorney told her afterward. He was in the room when Liam arrived, which she had not known she wanted until he was there, and she found that she did. He held the baby in the careful way of someone who has not held an infant before, and is aware of how much this particular infant matters, and is managing the weight of that awareness along with the physical logistics of the holding. And he looked down at the face, the new, foreign, complete face of his son, with an expression that she had never seen on him and had no precedent for, something that was not assessment and not calculation, and not the contained management of information, something entirely undefended, something that looked, from the outside, like a man encountering the one thing that was finally larger than himself. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The cooperation agreement resulted in a sentence of 4 years, reduced to 2.5 with cooperation credit and good behavior provisions. Damien accepted it without appeal. The morning he reported to the federal facility, Serena met him in the parking structure of his attorney's building. She had Liam in a carrier against her chest, 3 months old, asleep with the absolute commitment of the very young, his face pressed sideways against her sternum. Damien was in a dark jacket and dark trousers, carrying nothing. He had arranged everything, the attorneys, the assets, the clinic endowment, weeks before this morning. He looked at her. He looked at Liam. He reached out and put his hand against the back of the baby's head, the soft, warm weight of it, and held it there for a moment. He's not going to remember this, Serena said. I know. You're going to have to introduce yourself. I know that too. He looked up from the baby to her face. I'm going to do it right, the introduction. I need you to know that. I know, she said. They stood in the parking structure in the February cold, the 3 of them in the particular arrangement of a family that did not yet have the language for what it was, And she thought about the harbor and the concrete and a man she hadn't known who was bleeding out and a choice she'd made before she'd had time to think about it. And she thought that you could not have predicted from that moment any of this, that not the clinic or the brownstone or the warehouse or the name Liam, which they had chosen together 2 weeks before his birth on a Tuesday evening in her Logan Square apartment over the bad coffee she kept failing to improve, and that the inability to predict it was not a failure of foresight, but simply the nature of what it was. A series of choices made under pressure by imperfect people who did not have all the information they needed and made them anyway. She stepped forward and held him for a moment, one arm across his back with Liam between them, the baby warm and breathing and entirely unaware of any of it. Then she stepped back. "Go," she said. He went. 2.5 years is not a long time in the life of a city and is a very long time in the life of an infant who becomes a toddler, who becomes a small person with opinions about his shoes and a preferred cup and a growing vocabulary that skewed heavily toward the names of trucks. Serena ran the clinic. She expanded it over those 2.5 years, from 4 examining rooms to 7, from 3 staff to 9, from the operating budget she'd started with to something larger, funded by a combination of grants and the endowment that Damien had arranged before his sentence began, structured through a foundation that was entirely clean and entirely legitimate, and that she administered with the same focused attention she brought to everything. She talked to Liam about his father. Not in complicated terms, he was too young for complicated terms for most of the period, but consistently, in the way that her mother had told her truth was best delivered, regularly, simply, without drama. That his father was away because he had made mistakes and was doing what people do when they make mistakes, which is accept the consequence. That his father loved him, that his father was coming back. Liam absorbed this with the practical acceptance of the very young who have not yet learned to make absence into tragedy. She did not idealize Damien to the boy. She did not villainize him. She gave him the plain version, updated as Liam's capacity for complexity grew, and she found that the plain version, stripped of mythology in both directions, was easier to maintain and more useful, which was what her mother had always said about truth. Damien wrote letters. Not email, actual letters, on paper, mailed through the facility's correspondence system. He wrote to Serena and he wrote to Liam, and Serena read Liam's letters aloud to him when he was too young to read them himself, and left them in a box on the shelf in his room for when he was old enough to return to them. The letters to Serena were not love letters. They were not that kind of writing, which was consistent with everything she knew about how he communicated. They were honest accounts of the days, of the work he was doing in the facility's educational programs, of the things he was learning about himself in the specific way that extended enforced stillness teaches things that motion doesn't. They were the letters of a man slowly and without performance becoming something other than what he had been, and she read each one in her office with the door closed and then put it with the others in the drawer of her desk. She wrote back. Not every letter, not promptly, not at any particular interval. When she had something to say that felt worth the paper, she said it. She told him about the clinic, about Liam's shoes and the truck vocabulary, and the afternoon he had placed his toy stethoscope against the cat's chest, with a seriousness that had made her laugh until her eyes watered. She told him the true things, and she left out the things that weren't his to carry from a distance. It was not a romantic correspondence. It was something more durable than that. He came back on a Tuesday. She had not arranged anything particular for the day. No occasion, no ceremony, no constructed moment. She had told Liam that morning, in the plain way, that his father was coming home today. And Liam had absorbed this with his characteristic practicality and then asked if there would be pasta for dinner, and she had said probably yes, and that had been the conversation. She was in the clinic when Damien arrived. He had been given the address. He came through the front door at 11:15 in the morning, and she saw him through the window of her office. 2.5 years, and the particular way a person carries themselves either changes in that time or it doesn't, and she found she was watching to see which. He looked thinner, not unhealthy, thinner in the way of someone who has lost something they were carrying that they didn't know they were carrying. His posture was different in a way she couldn't precisely name. Still straight, still the same physical presence, but without the specific quality of compressed readiness that had always been in him, the sense of a man perpetually managing threats from multiple directions simultaneously. That was gone, or diminished, or resting. He stood in the clinic waiting room with its plastic chairs and its wall of children's drawings that the Thursday afternoon art program produced, and its particular smell of antiseptic and the old coffee maker that she still hadn't replaced. And he looked around the space with an expression she read as genuine, unperformed. She went out. He turned when he heard the door. They stood 8 feet apart in the waiting room. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You look different," she said. "So do you." 2.5 years. Yes. She crossed the 8 feet and put her arms around him, because that was what the moment required, and she was done maintaining distances that had served their purpose, and had now outlived it, and she felt his arms come around her with the careful force she remembered, careful of something precious, careful in the way of a man who had learned that careful was not the same as weak. They stood there for a moment. Then she stepped back. "Liam is at daycare," she said. "I'll pick him up at 2. "Okay." "You can come." He nodded. "Come sit down," she said. "I'll make you coffee." He followed her back through the clinic to her office, and she made him the bad coffee from the ancient machine and set it in front of him, and he sat across from her at the desk, the same way he had sat 2.5 years ago in the November dark, while Liam was 3 months old and pressed against her sternum, and the lamp from her graduate school apartment was still on the corner of the desk, and the photograph of her mother was still there, and outside the window the street moved in its ordinary way. "What do you want to do?" she said. "Now." He thought about it, genuinely thought about it. She could see the genuine quality of it, the absence of an answer already prepared. "I want to be useful," he said. "I don't know yet in what form. I have skills that are mostly not transferable to legitimate contexts." A pause. "Marcus has a security consulting firm. Legitimate. He started it 2 years ago. He's offered me a position. Will you take it?" "I think so." He looked at the coffee. "I want to be in one place. I want to be somewhere Liam can find me." She absorbed that. "I told him about you," she said. "Consistently. The plain version." He looked up. "I know," he said. "From your letters." A pause. "Thank you." She shook her head slightly. "Don't thank me for that. It was for him, not for you." "I know that too." Something moved in his face. "It matters anyway." They sat in the quiet office and drank the bad coffee, and outside the day moved normally, the way days do when the enormous internal events of lives are happening inside them, undetectable from the street, indistinguishable from any other Tuesday. At 1:30, she got her coat. He got up. They walked out of the clinic together and down the sidewalk toward the daycare, and the air was cold, and the street smelled like February in Chicago, exhaust and ice, and the particular mineral smell of a city in winter. And they walked 3 blocks without speaking, which was not uncomfortable, which was simply the quality of 2 people who had said enough of the right things at enough of the right moments that silence between them had become a different kind of speech. The daycare was a storefront on a side street, yellow paint on the door, the sound of children audible from the sidewalk. They stopped outside. She looked at him. "He's going to look at you," she said. "He's going to try to figure out what you are. He's 3. He'll do it in about 30 seconds, and then he'll want to show you something." "What does he usually want to show people?" "Whatever he's built most recently," she said. "He stacks things." He nodded slowly, taking it in. She pushed open the yellow door. The room was warm and loud in the specific way of rooms full of small people in the afternoon, the energy of approaching departure, children who sense the end of the day. She spotted Liam immediately. She always spotted him immediately, which was one of the things about parenthood she had not expected and could not explain. The particular frequency at which you locate your own, standing at a table near the window with a structure of wooden blocks that was ambitious for his age and precarious in its upper sections. He looked up when she came in. He registered her. Then he registered the man standing beside her, the 30 seconds she had predicted. Liam looked at Damien with the thorough, unself-conscious assessment of the very young, who have not yet learned the social convention of looking away. He looked at his face and his hands and his coat and back at his face, and his expression moved through several things with the transparency that 3-year-olds have not yet learned to manage. Then he picked up the top 3 blocks of his structure, carefully, knowing the physics of it by now, and walked across the room and held them out. Not to Serena, to Damien. Damien crouched down to the child's level. He took the blocks from the offered hands. He held them with the same careful force with which he held everything that mattered. He looked at his son. His son looked back. "Stack," Liam said. Damien looked at the blocks in his hands. "Show me how," he said. Liam took him by 2 fingers and led him back to the table, and Damien went, crouched and slightly off balance and entirely present. And Serena stood inside the yellow door with the winter air at her back and watched the 2 of them at the table with the blocks, her son explaining the structural logic with the serious authority of someone who has developed expertise, the father listening with an attention she recognized as genuine, not performed, not managed, simply the attention of a man who had decided that this was the most important thing in the room and was treating it accordingly. She did not move. She stood, and she let it be what it was. Imperfect, incomplete, the beginning of something that would take years to build and might still fall and would require both of them to choose it over and over again in the ordinary Tuesday moments when there was no crisis to clarify the stakes and only the daily work of it was left. She thought about the harbor. She thought about the concrete and the blood, and the choice she'd made before she'd had time to think about it, and she thought, this is where that goes. Not to a clean ending, not to a version of things where everyone was healed and the cost had been absorbed and the weight of it was gone. To this, a daycare on a side street in February, bad coffee, and a clinic that needed a new coffee maker. A man crouched at a table learning the structural logic of wooden blocks from a 3-year-old who had inherited his eyes and her stubbornness, which was going to be a combination that caused considerable difficulty for everyone in the years ahead. To this. She crossed the room and sat down at the table. Liam handed her blocks without looking up, allocating tasks with the natural authority of someone who has already decided who is responsible for what. She stacked. Outside, Chicago moved through its ordinary February afternoon, indifferent and enormous, and entirely unconcerned with the small, complete world at the table, by the window, the 3 of them building something out of what they had, which was not everything, which was enough.